One major issue, of course, is the war in Ukraine. Obviously, Trump has been relatively critical. Many within his coalition are very critical and think the U.S. Should do everything it can to bring that conflict to a close. So, and obviously, many are very opposed to that in Congress as well. So, one of the issues that I think is the most discussed and the most talked about in terms of what may or may not happen and what is happening there on the ground and what the reality really sets forth for us. So, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Glenn Diesen, who's a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and also the author of a book I've been digging into lately, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Mr. Diesen, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on.
Well, great to have you here with us. Earlier today, I saw that Mr. Keith Kellogg, General Keith Kellogg, who is going to be Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, has said that he's setting for himself a 100-day timeline starting on January 20th to end the war in Ukraine, that he's going to try to find a way to wind it down somehow, some way. How realistic does that seem to you? I mean, obviously, the war situation is not going well for Ukraine, but it does seem that there's quite a bit of resistance on the Ukrainian side to what to many seem, I think, like the most realistic options for a deal.
At least, extending it from 24 hours to ending the war to 100 days, it does seem more realistic, but it is a challenge. And again, I don't doubt that Trump genuinely wants to end the war. I think he sees it as too expensive. It can't be won. And probably more importantly for him, it's also pushing Russia and China closer together, which is creating other consequences such as de-dollarization, decoupling from the US in supply chains, a lot of things which is very bad for the United States' relative power in the world. So I think he wants to end this. But again, I'm a bit skeptical because it's what the Russians want now is a big ask, because they demand the core demand they had, which was initially agreed 3 years ago in Istanbul, was that Ukraine would restore its neutrality. There is no more NATO expansion. But that was the Istanbul agreement. Now, of course, after 3 years of war, there's also territorial concessions. So that's why it's referred to as Istanbul Plus. That is, restoring neutrality plus territorial concessions. So it's very difficult for Trump to deliver on this, given that he's the big deal maker. So I'm a bit skeptical to what extent it's possible to end this war. But you mentioned the Ukraine having some resistance. I think it's mostly from Zelensky. Again, if you look at the polling across Ukraine, there's not a single oblast left in Ukraine where they actually have a majority for wanting to continue the war. In the last poll I saw, only 16% support Zelensky, so they don't want this war. But again, Zelensky does. But again, the only reason why the war continues is because the US and to a lesser extent some Europeans keep supporting it. So if Trump pulls the plug, the war is over. It doesn't really matter what Zelensky thinks.
That's really interesting. You mentioned a poll number like that when Zelensky, is always trotted out as being this like real Democrat, like democratically beloved leader. But, I'm curious when it comes to the issue of Ukraine and, whatever it is Trump might want to do or not want to do, what is the ongoing impact on Europe? And moreover, has this war been in Europe's interest? I mean, I know the answer to that, but obviously, the people in charge of European policy tend to be in that Atlanticist camp. But yeah, I'm just curious, what has been the impact on Europe? And is there perhaps a shift in Europe when it comes to how they feel about going on with this war?
Well, first, just let me say with Zelensky, he did win on a democratic platform, but also on a peace platform. He won in 2019. He got a landslide victory with 73% of the votes. But this was on the basis of ending the war, so negotiating with Donbass, making peace with Russia, and implementing the Minsk agreement. He was then pressured by various non-governmental organizations and extreme right-wing forces, which the US and other European countries had allied themselves with. So after this, he became less and less popular. And when Medvedchuk, the main opposition, became more popular than him, he threw him in jail and later stripped him of his Ukrainian citizenship. So not so much democratic anymore, as he has cancelled all opposition parties and subordinated the media to himself. But in terms of Europe, I don't think anyone in Europe would anymore consider this to be in their interest. Again, if you go back to 2008, when NATO membership was promised to Ukraine, at least future membership, the Europeans knew that this would cause war. Merkel referred to it at that time as Moscow would interpret it as a declaration of war. So they were hesitant for a long time. But now things are kind of strange, because it looks like the Americans are pulling a bit back. Meanwhile, the Europeans are really very fearful that peace might break out. So they are very committed to this. Initially, they weren't this, but they assumed that Russia could be defeated on the battlefield. Its economy would collapse if enough sanctions would be pushed on it, and also the international community would isolate Russia. None of the above has happened. The Russian economy is growing. It's now the fourth largest in the world, according to the World Bank. They're defeating NATO's army, which is built, the Ukrainian army, which NATO has built, and while the West isolates Russia, it's been embraced by the rest of the world. It's been leading BRICS now, so it's I think it's gone very bad for Europe. And as the former German finance minister recognized a few days ago, the sanctions have been beneficial for US, but they've been very harmful for Europe. So we're seeing now European industries deindustrializing, and it's not as if our political leaders are going to change their mind, but if you continue to stare the continent off a cliff, then after a while, alternatives will come along. And we already see that the British the British government is on shaky grounds. The French, Macron is clinging on to power even after losing the election. The Germans are considering banning the main opposition party, which is AfD. Austria's just brought in a new party now, who will form a government, and they are opposed to sending more weapons to Ukraine. They want to make peace with Russia. You see Slovakia, Hungary suggesting the same. Italy doesn't want to send more weapons. So the mood is definitely shifting. We lost the war. That is, NATO lost the war. And slowly we'll come to terms with this. But there seems to be concerns about Trump pushing this peace and ending the war.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting reality when peace seems to be something that many people feel is the more dangerous option in the ruling circles in many countries. But, it's an interesting, I think, commentary, the point you were making about what people were considering would happen to Russia, that it would collapse, that all these different, negative impacts would happen. I mean, what do you think that says about and we talk a lot about the multipolar world. You, of course, have the new book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which is discussing this quite a bit. I mean, not that the U.S. is not extremely powerful, not that the West can't do many things, not that they have not been able to carry out a proxy war that undoubtedly has harmed Russia, even though if it hasn't collapsed it. But does this say something about the era of unipolarity, that despite what seems like the will to crush Russia, the West has not been able to do so?
It suggests that unipolarity is over. And this is why I also refer to this war as being about world order, because keep in mind that NATO expansion, it came at expense of agreements we had for an inclusive pan-European security architecture. So this was all abandoned. So NATO expansion was all about instead constructing a European security order based on collective hegemony. That is a Europe which Russia wouldn't belong to, which unavoidably becomes a Europe against Russia. And this is why at least me, I've been warning for the past 20 years that this would take us towards war, which it has. But again, unipolarity was always going to be a temporary phenomenon, because it's premised on the idea that you have to keep down all other rising powers emerging at the periphery. So the reason why I think it's also damaging for the United States is after a while it will exhaust its resources, it will go further down in debt, it will cause social problems, political divisions. And while it's exhausting its resources, which is transferred from the core to the periphery, you see then the rivals beginning to collectively balance the United States. And not just rivals of America, but you also see friends and allies. So Turkey, India, they're all joining in on reducing reliance on the dollar, American technologies, industries, transportation corridors, its banks, simply because they're afraid of secondary sanctions. And they see that administrative power the US, as well as lesser extent the Europeans, have had over the international economy is being weaponized to prevent the rise of rivals. And this is something everyone wants to overcome, which is why there's been such a demand for BRICS. So I don't think it's good for the US. It's not good for the world. I think everyone would have benefited from the United States, which have probably take a more modest role. So, but again, the main thought behind this, the Ukraine war, as many leaders, political leaders have said, is if you can knock out the Russians, then we can focus our resources on countering the Chinese. But instead, we see that the opposite has happened. A new alternative economic infrastructure has emerged. A lot of these countries have gotten closer together, and we didn't achieve any of it. And now, instead of knocking out Russia and restoring the unipolar order, we see that it's only intensifying the speed in which we're transitioning away from unipolarity and towards multipolarity.
So, Glenn, I'm curious, as we await this new Trump administration to come into office, what are the potential outcomes we could see, or the potential paths for the war in Ukraine? Obviously, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but in terms of like forecasting, what can we maybe expect to see one way or another, if you had to, I don't know, estimate what's the most likely outcome? I'll put it that way.
Well, I would assume that he wants to have a good deal, something that makes the United States also in a good position, and is not seen as simply selling out Ukraine to the Russians. So I'm assuming that he won't necessarily end the war right away. Indeed, if you cut off the Ukrainians completely, then you don't have much bargaining power when you sit down to negotiate with the Russians. But I think it's going to try to push more of the responsibility, that is the weapons and the finance, over to the Europeans, effectively say, this is your mess. America has more important priorities, so primarily pivoting to Asia. So I think this is where it's going. I think the Ukrainian army is disintegrating faster by the day. Things are really going poorly, but I'm not sure how much you can. My great concern is that he's not going to be able to negotiate a peace simply because it might be based on the wrong premises. I mean, for so long, both the Americans and Europeans have been talking about the stagnant front lines, and it's a stalemate. But this is not correct. It's a war of attrition in which you bleed adversaries dry before you take territory. We seem to measure everything in territory over here. But the Ukrainian army is collapsing. Once it's collapsing now, you see territories shifting increasingly fast. In the old days, 2 years ago, the Russians had to essentially bomb every single building to the ground before they could take a city. Now they're moving into fortified lines, which are unmanned effectively. So things are falling apart very fast. You're having huge desertions in Ukraine. More larger groups of Ukrainians are being surrounded in these cauldrons. The weapons are falling apart, communication is breaking down, morale is dropping. So things are quite horrible. And I guess this is also a negative thing. If you're going to make a peace deal, there's no way Ukraine can get out of this well. And for a country that has suffered so much, lost hundreds of thousands of men and its territory, it's going to be very hard to sell the horrible deal, which we'll end up with now.
Well, a lot to not look forward to, but a lot to be seen, I guess, as we have the incoming administration here and even the final days of the Biden administration and others. Glenn Diesen, professor at University of Southeastern Norway and author of the book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which I've been enjoying quite a bit. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks again for the invitation.